The prairie wind carried whispers of change across the Dakota Territory in the autumn of 1858. Margaret Sullivan stood at the edge of Willow Creek Settlement, her traveling dress still dusty from the 3-week journey that had brought her from Boston to this raw frontier town. At 26, widowed for nearly 2 years, she had accepted a teaching position here not out of adventure, but necessity. The consumption that took her husband Thomas had also taken their savings, leaving her with little choice but to venture west, where teachers were desperately needed and questions about one's past were rarely asked. The settlement sprawled haphazardly along the new railroad line, a collection of hastily constructed buildings that seemed to huddle together against the vastness of the surrounding plains. The schoolhouse, her new domain, stood at the town's northern edge, a simple wooden structure with real glass windows, a luxury in these parts. Sheriff Coleman had proudly pointed it out during her arrival, along with stern warnings about venturing too far from town. Sioux territory begins just past those bluffs, he'd said, gesturing toward the rolling hills that rose like earthen waves against the horizon. They've been peaceful enough lately, but a woman alone must be careful. Always stay within sight of town. Mrs. Sullivan. Margaret had nodded dutifully, though something in her rebelled against yet another set of restrictions. In Boston, it had been the suffocating propriety of mourning customs. Here, it seemed, the cage was merely larger, bounded by invisible lines drawn between civilization and what the townsfolk called savage lands. 3 days into her new life, she discovered the spring. She'd been following what appeared to be a deer path, searching for late-blooming wildflowers to brighten the stark schoolroom. The sound of water had drawn her through a stand of cottonwoods, their leaves already turning gold in the early autumn light. There, hidden from the settlement's view, lay a natural spring that fed into a clear pool before meandering away as a narrow creek. The beauty of it stopped her breath. Limestone rocks formed natural steps down to the water's edge, and ancient trees provided a cathedral-like canopy overhead. It felt sacred, untouched by the grasping hands of progress that were reshaping the frontier. She knelt at the water's edge, cupping the cold, sweet water to her lips. That's when she saw him. He stood waist-deep in the pool, water streaming from his long black hair. For a moment, neither moved. Margaret's mind catalogued details with the strange clarity that comes with shock, the broad shoulders marked with scars, the copper skin that seemed to glow in the filtered sunlight, the guarded wariness in dark eyes that watched her with the same frozen surprise she felt. He was Lakota. She knew this instinctively, though she'd never seen a native person this close. Everything Sheriff Coleman had warned against crystallized in this moment. She was alone, far from town, facing one of the hostels the settlement men spoke of in hushed, fearful tones. Yet he made no threatening move. Instead, he raised one hand slowly, palm outward, and spoke a single word in a language she didn't understand. His voice was deep, carefully neutral. When she remained frozen, he tried again in accented English. "I mean no harm." Margaret found her voice, though it emerged as barely a whisper.
I didn't know anyone was here. I'll go."
"This is sacred water," he said, still maintaining that careful distance. "But you drank with respect. You may stay." Something in his manner, dignified despite his vulnerable position, made her bold. "I'm the new teacher at the settlement." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "I know. The whole prairie knows. A woman alone who teaches children their letters." He moved toward the far bank where she now noticed clothes folded on a rock. "I am called Riverhawk in your tongue." "Margaret Sullivan," she replied automatically, then felt foolish for the formal introduction. What was the etiquette for meeting an undressed man of any race at a secret spring? He pulled himself from the water with fluid grace, and she quickly averted her eyes, though not before noticing more scars across his back, some old and faded, others more recent. When she looked again, he had wrapped a blanket around his waist and was studying her with curious intensity. "You are not like the others from the town," he observed, How do you know what the others are like? We watch. We know who builds with greed and who builds with hope. We know who comes with guns and who comes with books. He gestured toward the settlement. Your people fear what they do not understand. They're not my people, Margaret said, surprising herself with the vehemence. I mean, I've only just arrived. Riverhawk pulled on his clothes, a mix of traditional leather and traded cloth that spoke of two worlds intersecting. Yet you will live among them. Teach their children to think like them. I'll teach them to read and write and cipher, she corrected. What they think is their own business. This earned her a fuller smile and a praising look. Spoken like someone who has not yet learned how the frontier shapes thoughts. But perhaps... He paused, seeming to weigh his words. Perhaps you are different. He moved to leave, then turned back. This spring, few white people know of it. The stones here are old, placed by my people's ancestors. If you come here, come with respect. I will, Margaret promised, meaning it. And come alone, he added. If the men from town discovered this place, he didn't finish, but his meaning was clear. After he left, moving through the trees with a silence that seemed impossible, Margaret remained by the spring. Her hands trembled as she dipped them again in the water. She should have been terrified, should have run back to town immediately to report the encounter. Instead, she felt more alive than she had in years. The next few days passed in a blur of establishing routines. 14 children attended the school, ranging from 6 to 16 years old. They were a mix of farmers' children, sons and daughters of railroad workers, and 2 girls whose father ran the general store. Margaret threw herself into the work, but her mind kept drifting to the spring and the unexpected encounter there. She returned 4 days later, telling herself she merely needed water for the wildflowers she'd finally gathered. The spring was empty, peaceful in the late afternoon light. She filled her jar quickly, disappointed by a feeling she didn't want to examine too closely. You came back. She nearly dropped the jar. Riverhawk stood at the tree line, dressed this time in buckskin leggings and a cotton shirt. He carried a hunting bow, but no evident tension in his posture. The water here is sweeter than from the town well, she said, immediately feeling foolish for the transparent excuse. Yes, he agreed solemnly, though she caught amusement in his eyes. Much sweeter. They stood in awkward silence until Margaret noticed the rabbits hanging from his belt. Successful hunt. The Creator provides when we ask with humility. He moved to the spring's edge, setting down his weapons with careful deliberation, a gesture of peace. She realized. You are not afraid today. Should I be? My people say fear is wisdom in the face of danger, but sometimes... He crouched by the water, cupping it to drink. Sometimes fear blinds us to what is truly dangerous and what is merely different. Margaret found herself sitting on one of the flat stones, her jar of water forgotten. And which are you? That depends, Riverhawk said, settling cross-legged at a respectful distance. On whether you believe the stories told in your town. What stories do they tell? His expression darkened. That we are savage, that we steal children and burn homes, that we stand in the way of their destiny to claim all lands from sea to sea. He picked up a small stone, turning it in his fingers. Some stories have truth. We have warriors who raid when the treaty promises are broken, when our children starve because the buffalo are gone. But they do not tell stories of your soldiers who attack sleeping villages, who kill women and babies, who take scalps for bounty. Margaret felt the weight of history she barely understood pressing down on this quiet glade. I'm sorry, she said simply. You did not do these things. No, but I benefit from them. My presence here, the school, the town, it all exists because your people were pushed back. Riverhawk looked at her for a long moment. You see clearly. That is rare. He stood, preparing to leave. I should not speak with you. My chief would say I endanger our people by trusting any white face. Then why do you... He paused at the tree line. Perhaps because you drank from sacred water with a humble heart. Perhaps because you teach children, and teachers in any tongue are worthy of respect. Or perhaps, he smiled slightly, perhaps because the spirits whisper that some meetings are meant to be. Over the following weeks, their encounters at the spring took on a rhythm. Margaret would arrive in the late afternoon when her teaching duties were done. And, more often than not, Riverhawk would appear. Sometimes they talked, carefully at first, then with growing ease. He taught her words in Lakota: Memonai for water, Wangbli for eagle, waste for good. She shared stories from her books, described life in Boston, explained how steam engines worked. "Your husband?" Riverhawk asked one day, noting the black mourning band she still wore. "He died 2 winters ago. Lung sickness." Margaret traced patterns in the sand at the water's edge. "Everyone said I should remarry quickly, but I chose this instead. A new life where I'm not just the widow Sullivan. In my culture, a woman who loses her warrior is honored for her grief but not imprisoned by it. She chooses when to set aside mourning." He studied her carefully. "You still wear the black?" "Habit, I suppose, and protection. A widow is safer from certain attentions." Understanding dawned in his eyes. "Ah, like war paint, but for a different kind of battle." Their friendship, for she had begun to think of it as such, existed in a bubble outside the rigid rules of both their worlds. At the spring, she was not the proper Boston widow turned frontier teacher, and he was not the feared Lakota warrior. They were simply 2 people finding unexpected connection across a chasm of difference. But bubbles, Margaret knew, were fragile things. The first sign of trouble came in early October. She arrived at the spring to find Riverhawk already there, tension radiating from his usually calm demeanor. "Soldiers came to our village," he said without preamble. "They say we stole horses from a ranch to the south. We did not, but truth matters little when they seek excuse for conflict." "What will happen?" "My chief counsel's patience. We will send envoys, speak truth, hope for justice." His laugh was bitter. Hope, a thin thread to hang lives upon. Margaret felt the precariousness of their stolen moments crystallize into sharp fear. "Perhaps you shouldn't come here anymore, if they're watching your people. If I live in fear of what might be, I am already defeated." He moved closer than propriety allowed, close enough that she could see the pain behind his stoic expression. "Tell me of your Boston. Tell me of a place where buildings reach the sky and people ride in carriages without horses." So she did, painting word pictures of cobblestone streets and gaslight evenings, of libraries with thousands of books and concerts halls where orchestras played. He listened with focused intensity, as if storing away each detail. "I would like to see such things," he said when she finished. "But I think my path leads elsewhere." "Paths can change," Margaret said softly. "I never thought mine would lead here." "No," Riverhawk agreed, his gaze holding hers. "Some paths surprise us." The moment stretched between them, heavy with unspoken possibilities. Then, as always, reality intruded. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. Margaret stood reluctantly. "I should return. They'll wonder." Yes, but neither moved. Finally, Riverhawk stepped back, breaking the spell. "Be careful. Margaret Sullivan, your world does not forgive those who cross its boundaries." Walking back to town, Margaret felt the weight of his warning. She thought of the careful distances maintained at their meetings, the way they circled around truths too dangerous to speak aloud. She thought of how his rare smiles had become precious to her, how she found herself counting days between their encounters. At the schoolhouse, she lit the oil lamp and tried to focus on preparing tomorrow's lessons, but her mind kept returning to dark eyes that saw too much, to scarred hands that moved with surprising gentleness, to a voice that made her English name sound like music. Outside, The prairie wind rose, rattling the windows. Somewhere beyond the safe circle of town lights, Riverhawk's people faced an uncertain future. And here, in her small sanctuary of books and chalk dust, Margaret Sullivan faced the terrifying realization that her carefully reconstructed life was already beginning to crack at the foundations. The spring had given her more than sweet water. It had given her a connection that defied every rule she'd been taught, every boundary her world demanded she maintain. As she finally blew out the lamp and made her way to her small rooms above the dry goods store, Margaret wondered if some boundaries, once crossed, could ever be restored. The stars above the prairie seemed to pulse with possibility and warning in equal measure. And somewhere in the darkness between two worlds, a sacred spring held secrets that would soon demand a price neither Margaret nor Riverhawk could yet imagine. The first snow came early that year, dusting the Dakota plains in a thin white veil by late October. Margaret pulled her shawl tighter as she made her way to the spring, her footprints leaving a telltale trail she hoped would be obscured before anyone noticed. These meetings had become essential to her, like air or water, necessary for survival in ways she didn't fully understand. Riverhawk was teaching her to see the land differently, where she once saw emptiness. She now noticed the subtle signs of life, the way rabbits had worn paths through the grass, how certain plants grew near water, which birds announced changes in weather. In exchange, she brought books when she could, reading aloud from poetry or adventure stories that made him laugh with their romanticized versions of frontier life. "You're writers," he said one afternoon, after she'd finished a particularly dramatic passage about savage raids. "They must have very good imaginations."
You mean it's not accurate?
Margaret asked with mock innocence. "If we attacked like this story says, whooping and riding in circles, we would all be dead long ago." He demonstrated the theatrical war cry described in the book, making her laugh until her sides hurt. "We survive because we are smart, not because we are loud." Their shared laughter died as they heard horses approaching. Riverhawk moved swiftly, pulling Margaret behind the large cottonwood trees. Through the lattice of branches, they watched 3 cavalry soldiers water their horses at the spring. "Clear so far," one said, "but keep your eyes open. Orders are to map every water source within 20 miles of the settlement." "Planning for something big?" another asked. "Colonel thinks if we control the water, we control the hostiles. Dry season coming next summer could be useful leverage." Margaret felt Riverhawk tense beside her, his hand moving instinctively to the knife at his belt. She touched his arm gently, a warning to stay still. The soldiers lingered for what seemed like hours, but was probably only minutes before mounting up and continuing their patrol. They waited in silence until the sound of hoofbeats faded completely. When Riverhawk finally spoke, his voice was tight with controlled anger. "They map our sacred places like plotting conquest." He stepped away from their hiding spot, pacing the spring's edge like a caged wolf. "This water has flowed since before memory. My grandmother's grandmother drank here, prayed here, and they would make it a weapon against us." "I'm sorry," Margaret said, knowing how inadequate the words were. "You apologize often for things not of your making." "Because I don't know what else to say. Because being sorry is all I can offer." He stopped pacing, studying her with those penetrating dark eyes. "You could offer truth. Tell them this place is sacred. Tell them—" "They wouldn't listen to me. I'm just the schoolmarm, and a newcomer at that. Sheriff Coleman already watches me with suspicion because I take long walks alone. Then we are both trapped by what others expect of us." The anger drained from him, replaced by something that looked like sorrow. "Come, I will show you something." He led her along the stream, further than they'd ventured before, to where the water pooled again in a smaller, hidden grove. Ancient pictographs marked the rocks here, faded but still visible. "My people's history," he explained, tracing the symbols with reverent fingers. "This tells of the first meetings between our tribe and yours. Here, this shows the treaty signing, when we believed promises of mutual respect. And here," his hand stilled, This shows what came after. Margaret studied the images, stylized but clear enough broken promises. Conflict, loss. Who made these? My uncle. He was a keeper of stories before the soldiers killed him at Sand Creek. Riverhawk's voice remained steady, but she heard the pain beneath. He taught me that history lives not just in marks on stone, but in the telling, in the remembering. Tell me, Margaret said softly. Help me remember. So he did. As afternoon shadows lengthened, Riverhawk shared stories of his people, not the savage tales told in the settlement, but accounts of a complex society with laws and traditions, joys and sorrows, wisdom accumulated over generations. He spoke of the buffalo hunts before the great herds were decimated, of ceremonies that marked the seasons, of children raised by entire villages in love and discipline. We are not perfect, he said. We war among ourselves, make mistakes, struggle with change, but we are people, not the monsters or mystical spirits your kind make us to be. Margaret absorbed it all, feeling her worldview shift and reshape with each story. In Boston, she said slowly, they speak of manifest destiny as if God himself ordained that white civilization should sweep from sea to sea. I never questioned it before. And now? Now I see the cost. She met his gaze steadily. Now I see you. Something shifted in the air between them, a recognition that went beyond words. Riverhawk reached out, almost touching her face, then let his hand fall. This is dangerous, he said quietly. I know. Not just for us, for my people, for your position in the town. We should stop meeting. I know, Margaret repeated, but neither moved to leave. The next few weeks brought a fever of stolen moments. Margaret found herself creating excuses for water-gathering trips, while Riverhawk appeared with increasing frequency despite the risks. They developed a system of signals. A particular arrangement of stones meant it was safe to meet. Disturbed Earth warned of recent patrols. He taught her practical skills under the guise of cultural exchange, how to move quietly through dry leaves, which plants could heal minor wounds, how to read weather signs. She reciprocated by teaching him written English beyond the basic trading vocabulary he knew. Your letters are like bird tracks, he complained one day, struggling with her cursive writing. Why not make them clear? Because beauty matters too, she said, guiding his hand to form the flowing letters. Not everything needs to be purely functional. The touch of his hand under hers sent an unexpected jolt through her. They both stilled, awareness crackling between them. Margaret pulled away first, busying herself with organizing the writing materials she'd brought. I should tell you, Riverhawk said carefully. My chief speaks of moving our band further west, away from the soldiers, the settlers, perhaps beyond the Black Hills. The news hit Margaret like a physical blow. When? Perhaps spring, perhaps sooner if the pressure grows worse. He watched her reaction closely. It would be safer for everyone. Of course, she managed. That's wise. But her hands trembled as she packed away the paper and ink. The thought of the spring without him, of returning to the empty politeness of settlement society, made her chest tight with panic she couldn't name. That evening, back in her rooms, Margaret stared at her reflection in the small mirror above her washstand. When had the hollow-eyed widow from Boston transformed into this woman with wind-chapped cheeks and secrets burning behind her eyes? When had duty become a cage rather than a comfort? The next morning brought disturbing news. During Sunday service, which Margaret attended out of obligation rather than faith, Reverend Morrison announced that a ranch to the south had been raided. 3 horses stolen, property destroyed. He intoned from the pulpit, The Lord calls us to righteous defense against the heathen threat. Whispers rippled through the congregation. Margaret caught fragments, knew we couldn't trust them, should drive them all out. Only language they understand is force. Mrs. Watson, the banker's wife, leaned over to Margaret. You must be frightened. Dear, Walking about alone as you do, perhaps you should consider curtailing your nature expeditions. I'm quite safe, thank you, Margaret replied, fighting to keep her voice level. Still, one can't be too careful. Why, just yesterday, my husband saw Indian sign not 2 miles from town, bold as brass. They're getting... After service, Sheriff Coleman approached Margaret. He was a large man who wore his authority like an ill-fitting coat, always tugging at it to make sure others noticed.
Mrs. Sullivan, a word.
She waited, hands folded, projecting what she hoped was innocent attention. Folks have noticed your frequent walks. Now, I'm not one to tell a lady her business, but with tensions rising, might be best to keep closer to town. I appreciate your concern. Sheriff, my students enjoy the plant samples I collect for our nature studies. His eyes narrowed slightly. Funny thing about plants, they grow just as well inside the settlement boundaries. Not all of them, Margaret said pleasantly. Education requires a broader perspective, don't you think? He studied her for a long moment. Just remember, ma'am, your safety is my responsibility. Wouldn't want anything unfortunate to happen to our school teacher. The threat was subtle, but clear. Margaret maintained her smile until he walked away, then slumped against the church wall. How long before someone followed her? How long before her careful secret shattered? She almost didn't go to the spring that day, but the thought of Riverhawk waiting, possibly worried, drew her out. She took a circuitous route, doubling back twice to ensure she wasn't followed. He was there, tension evident in every line of his body. The raid, he said immediately. It was not my people. I didn't think. Others are already thinking it. He ran a hand through his hair. A gesture she'd learned meant deep agitation. The horses were taken by white men. We tracked them. The shoe patterns are clear. But who will believe us? Could you show the tracks to the sheriff? His look was answer enough. They see what they expect to see, and what they expect is guilt from any brown face. Margaret felt the walls closing in on both of them. What can I do? Nothing. Stay away from me. From this place. But even as he said it, he moved closer. You risk too much. That's my choice to make. Is it when your choice affects my people? If they discover our meetings, they will say I corrupted you, used savage magic to cloud your mind. It would give them excuse for whatever violence they plan. The truth of it stung. Margaret felt tears threaten, born of frustration and fear and something else she didn't dare name. I don't want to lose this, she whispered. To lose you. Riverhawk's control finally cracked. He framed her face with his hands, thumbs brushing away the tears that had escaped. Waste Mithawa, he murmured. My heart sees yours. They stood frozen, balanced on a precipice. Then, slowly, as if fighting himself, Riverhawk stepped back. This is why we must be strong, why I must leave you in peace. His voice roughened. Before we cross lines that cannot be uncrossed. But Margaret, who had been proper and dutiful all her life, found her courage. What if I want to cross them? Then you are braver than I, he said softly. Or more foolish. Perhaps both. Despite everything, he smiled, that rare, full smile that transformed his usually serious face. Yes, perhaps both. They parted with nothing resolved, everything more complicated than before. Margaret walked back to town feeling as though she carried a storm inside her chest. At the schoolhouse, she tried to lose herself in lesson planning, but the words swam before her eyes. A knock at the door interrupted her brooding. Young Tom Harper, one of her students, stood on the step with a bundle of papers. Ma'am, my PA said to give you these. Said you might want to know what folks are saying. The papers were recent copies of the territorial newspaper, full of inflammatory rhetoric about the Indian question and demands for more aggressive military action. One editorial particularly chilled her. The time for half measures has passed. Complete separation of races is the only path to peace and progress. "Thank you, Tom," she managed.
Please thank your father for me.
The boy hesitated. "Ma'am, my PA also said. Well, he said you're a good teacher and all, but maybe you should be careful about being different. Folks here don't much like different." After he left, Margaret sank into her chair, newspapers crumpling in her grip. The message was clear: conform or face consequences. But how could she return to that narrow life when Riverhawk had shown her how wide the world truly was? That night, she made her decision. Taking up her pen, she began to write, not a lesson plan, but a letter to the territorial governor about the sacred spring, about the humanity of the Lakota people, about the need for true justice rather than convenient scapegoating. She knew it was likely futile, possibly dangerous, but silence had become its own form of lie. As she wrote, she thought of Riverhawk's hands tracing ancient pictographs, of stories that demanded remembering, of connections that defied every boundary her world imposed. Whatever came next, she would face it with eyes open, no longer content to see only what others expected her to see. The spring would keep flowing, carrying its sacred waters through a landscape of change, and Margaret Sullivan, no longer just the proper widow from Boston, would learn what price the frontier demanded for choosing love over safety, truth over comfortable lies. The November sky hung low and gray, pregnant with snow that refused to fall. Margaret's letter to the territorial governor had gone unanswered for 2 weeks, though she hadn't truly expected a response. What she hadn't expected was how the act of writing it had changed something fundamental within her, as if putting truth to paper had made it impossible to continue living lies. She stood at the edge of the spring, watching her breath cloud in the cold air. Riverhawk was late, and worry gnawed at her. The settlement had been buzzing with talk of increased military patrols, of plans to establish new forts along traditional Lakota hunting routes. Each day brought fresh rumors, each more dire than the last. When he finally appeared, she knew immediately something was wrong. His face bore the controlled expression she'd learned masked deep turmoil, and dried blood stained his shirt sleeve.
"You're hurt,"
she said, moving toward him. "It's nothing. A disagreement with soldiers who thought our hunting party was a war band." He allowed her to examine the gash along his forearm, sitting still as she cleaned it with water from the spring. "This needs proper tending," Margaret said, fighting to keep her voice steady. "The wound was deep, though thankfully clean.
Our healer will see to it."
But he made no move to leave, watching her face with an intensity that made her hands tremble. "You should not have come today. Neither should you." "No," he agreed. "Neither should I." Margaret tore strips from her petticoat to bind the wound, trying not to think about the impropriety of the action, the intimacy of it. His skin was warm under her fingers despite the cold day.
"There,"
she said, tying off the makeshift bandage.
"Though I still think—"
"Margaret." The way he said her name stopped her words. "My chief has decided. We leave before the next new moon. The soldiers grow too bold, the settlers too many. We go north, then west, to where my cousin's band has found valleys still untouched." The news shouldn't have surprised her. He'd warned her it was coming, but hearing the certainty in his voice, the finality of it, made her sway on her feet. Riverhawk steadied her with his uninjured arm, and suddenly they were closer than they'd ever been, close enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his dark eyes, feel the warmth radiating from his body. "This is for the best," he said, but his voice lacked conviction.
"For who?" Margaret whispered.
"For everyone. For you, who risks everything with these meetings. For my people, who need no more reasons for the soldiers to hate us. For—"
"Stop."
She pulled back enough to meet his gaze.
"Don't pretend this is noble sacrifice.
We're both cowards, too afraid to admit what this really is."
Fire flashed in his eyes. "You think me a coward?"
"I think we're both so concerned with doing what's expected that we're willing to let something precious die." The words poured out, unstoppable now. "I think about you every moment, when I teach, when I pray. when I lie awake listening to the wind. You've shown me what it means to truly see, truly live. And now you want me to go back to being blind. And what would you have me do? His control shattered, voice rising. Take you with me, make you an outcast from your people as I would be from mine. Watch you grow to hate the hardship of our life. Hate me for stealing your world. I already hate my world. The confession erupted from her, raw and honest. I hate the small minds and smaller hearts. I hate teaching children lies about manifest destiny while truth gets buried with the dead. I hate pretending that this, she gestured between them, is wrong when it's the only thing in my life that feels right. Riverhawk stared at her, something desperate and wild in his expression. Then, as if a dam had broken, he pulled her against him, his mouth finding hers in a kiss that was part anguish, part fierce joy. The world disappeared. There was only the circle of his arms, the warmth of his lips, the thundering of two hearts finally allowed to beat in rhythm. Margaret had been kissed before, chaste, proper kisses from her late husband that had stirred only mild affection. This was different. This was lightning and earth tremors and coming home all at once. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Riverhawk rested his forehead against hers. Now you see why I call myself coward, he said roughly. Because I am not strong enough to stay away from you. Then be weak with me, Margaret whispered. Just for today, just for now. He kissed her again, gentle this time, savoring. His hands cradled her face like something precious, thumbs tracing her cheekbones with reverent wonder. Margaret let herself melt into him, storing every sensation against the lonely days ahead. They spent the afternoon in a desperate kind of peace, knowing it might be their last. Riverhawk spread his blanket beside the spring, and they sat close together, sharing warmth against the chill. He told her about the places his people would go, valleys where eagles nested, streams so clear you could count every pebble on the bottom. She told him about her childhood in Boston, about the mother who died young and the father who'd never quite known what to do with a daughter who asked too many questions. In another world, Riverhawk said softly, I would court you properly, bring horses to your family, prove myself worthy. In another world, Margaret replied, I'd be allowed to choose my own path without the weight of everyone else's expectations. Perhaps there are no other worlds, only this one, where we must make impossible choices. As the sun began its descent, painting the sky in shades of rose and amber, Margaret made her own impossible choice. She turned to face Riverhawk fully, taking his hands in hers. Let me feel you once, she begged, her voice barely above a whisper. Let me have one memory that's wholly ours, untainted by fear or duty or tomorrow's sorrow. Riverhawk's breath caught. His hands tightened on hers, and she saw the war play out in his eyes, desire against honor, need against wisdom. Margaret, he said, her name a prayer and a plea. I'm not asking for forever, she said, though her heart cried out for exactly that. I'm asking for now, for something real to hold on to when everything else feels like shadow. He studied her face for a long moment, then pulled her into a forbidden embrace that spoke of everything they couldn't say. His lips found hers again, and this time there was no hesitation, no holding back. Just two souls recognizing each other across an impossible divide, choosing connection over isolation, love over safety. They loved each other there beside the sacred spring, under the vast Dakota sky, with a tenderness that transcended the physical. Each touch was a promise, each whispered endearment a defiance of the world that would keep them apart. Riverhawk mapped her body like territory he was trying to memorize, while Margaret gave herself with an abandon she hadn't known she possessed. Afterwards, they lay entwined under his blanket, watching the first stars appear in the darkening sky. Margaret traced the scars on his chest, each one a story of survival. No regrets, Riverhawk asked softly. None, she said firmly, except Except that we can't have more time, that I can't wake beside you tomorrow and all the tomorrows after. He pressed a kiss to her forehead. Time is a river, flowing always forward. But sometimes, rivers circle back to places they've been before. Is that a promise? It's a hope, he said. Sometimes hope is all we have. They dressed in silence as full darkness fell, both aware that everything had changed. At the edge of the tree line, Riverhawk stopped her. There's something I must tell you, he said. My English name, the one I used at the mission school before I left. It's Samuel. Samuel Crow Feather. Margaret's throat tightened. The gift of his true name, after all these months, felt like both greeting and farewell. Samuel, she repeated softly, tasting the shape of it. He touched her face one last time. Be careful. Margaret Sullivan. The world is harsh to women who color outside its lines. I've already crossed those lines, she said. There's no going back now. After he left, Margaret stood alone by the spring, her body still humming with the memory of his touch. She felt transformed, reborn, as if she'd shed an old skin and emerged raw and new. The proper widow, Sullivan, was gone, replaced by someone wilder, truer, more dangerous. The walk back to town had never seemed longer. Each step felt like movement through thick honey, her body reluctant to return to a world that suddenly felt unbearably false. At the edge of the settlement, she paused to smooth her hair, straighten her clothes, arrange her features into the expected mask of propriety. But masks, she was learning, had a way of cracking. Over the next days, Margaret threw herself into her teaching with renewed passion, but her students noticed the change. She taught them poetry that spoke of freedom and wild places, had them draw maps not just of territories, but of dreams. When young Sarah Coleman asked why they had to learn about wars and dates, Margaret heard herself saying, because history is written by those who win, and you need to know how to read between the lines for truth. The girl's father, the sheriff, was at her door that very evening. Mrs. Sullivan, he said without preamble. I'm hearing concerning things about your teaching methods. Oh, Margaret kept her voice light, though her heart raced. I wasn't aware that encouraging critical thinking was concerning. Don't play coy with me, ma'am. You're filling these children's heads with dangerous ideas. My Sarah came home questioning the righteousness of westward expansion. I merely encouraged her to consider multiple perspectives on historical events. His face reddened. There's only one perspective that matters, the American perspective. You'd do well to remember that. After he left, Margaret sank into her chair, shaking. The walls were closing in faster than she'd expected. How long before someone noticed her disheveled state that evening she'd returned from the spring? How long before suspicion turned to accusation? That night, she made another decision. Taking up her pen again, she began to write, not letters to indifferent officials, but truth itself, the story of Riverhawk's people, of the sacred spring, of two souls who found each other across an impossible divide. She wrote until her hand cramped and her candle guttered, pouring everything onto paper that might someday bear witness. Outside her window, snow finally began to fall, covering the prairie in pristine white that would hide all tracks, all evidence of paths taken and choices made. But Margaret knew that some marks went deeper than snow could cover. Some choices echoed beyond the reach of winter's concealment. Somewhere out there, Riverhawk, Samuel, prepared to lead his people to safety, and here in her small room above the dry goods store, Margaret Sullivan prepared for her own journey into unknown territory, where love had made her brave and truth had made her dangerous. The spring would freeze soon, its waters hidden under ice until the world turned warm again. But Margaret carried its flow within her now, sacred and secret and eternal, as the love she'd found and lost and would carry forever in her transformed heart. The rumors started as whispers, barely audible over the clink of coffee cups at the boarding house breakfast table. Margaret kept her eyes on her plate, cutting her biscuit with careful precision while Mrs. Donnelly held court. Sarah Coleman swears she saw someone out by Willow Creek last week, a figure in the trees, watching the town. Indians. Mr. Hartwell muttered into his beard. Mark my words, they're planning something. Now, Mrs. Donnelly chided, though her eyes gleamed with the pleasure of gossip. Could have been anyone, though it is strange how often our dear Mrs. Sullivan walks that direction. Margaret felt the weight of several gazes turn her way. She looked up calmly, years of Boston society training serving her well. The creek is where I collect the best clay samples for our geography lessons. Would you prefer I use inferior materials? Of course not, dear. Mrs. Donnelly said sweetly. We just worry about you, all alone out there. Why, anything could happen to a woman without protection. The threat was veiled, but clear. Margaret excused herself soon after, claiming preparation for the day's lessons. But as she climbed the stairs to her room, she heard Mrs. Donnelly's voice drift up. Mark my words, that woman is hiding something. In her room, Margaret pressed trembling hands to her face. It had been 2 weeks since Riverhawk left, 2 weeks of emptiness that yawned like a chasm in her chest. She'd returned to the spring only once, finding it deserted and somehow smaller without his presence. The sacred stones seemed to reproach her with their silence. At school, she forced herself through the motions of teaching, but her heart wasn't in it. The children sensed her distraction. Young Tom Harper raised his hand during the history lesson. Mrs. Sullivan, my PA says the cavalry's planning a big campaign come spring. Says they're going to clear out all the hostiles for good. Is that true? Margaret's chalk stilled on the board. I don't know what the cavalry plans, Tom, but I do know that calling people hostiles makes it easier to forget they're human beings with families and homes. But they are hostile, insisted Clara Morrison, the Reverend's daughter. They steal and kill and... Do they? Margaret turned to face the class. Or do they defend what's theirs when others try to take it? Imagine if strangers came to Willow Creek and said our land was now theirs. What would your fathers do? The children fell silent, considering this. Then Clara spoke again, her voice smaller. But we're civilized. It's different. Is it? Margaret asked gently. What makes one person more deserving of land and life than another? The door burst open. Sheriff Coleman stood there, his face dark with anger. Mrs. Sullivan, a word, now! Margaret set down her chalk with steady hands. Children, read chapters 3 and 4 in your primers. I'll return shortly. Coleman waited until they were outside before exploding. How dare you fill my daughter's head with Indian-loving nonsense? I've had complaints from half the parents in town. I'm teaching them to think critically. You're teaching them to sympathize with savages. He stepped closer, using his bulk to intimidate. I've been patient with your peculiarities, ma'am, but my patience is at an end. Either you teach proper American values, or you find another position. Margaret lifted her chin. And what values would those be? Sheriff, that might makes right that different means less than... His hand moved to his gun belt, an unconscious gesture of threat. Careful, Mrs. Sullivan. You're walking on dangerous ground. That evening, Margaret found a note slipped under her door. Anonymous, of course, but the message was clear. We know about your meetings by the creek. Leave town or face the consequences. She spent the night pacing her small room, fear and anger warring in her chest. Part of her wanted to flee, to find safety in some other town where her past was unknown. But the larger part, the part Riverhawk had awakened, refused to bow to intimidation. The next day brought worse news. A ranch 10 miles south had been attacked, this time with casualties. 2 cowboys dead, livestock stolen. The town erupted in fury, men gathering in the saloon to plan retaliation. It's them Lakota for certain, she heard through her window. Tracks leading north, toward their camps. Margaret's blood ran cold. North was where Riverhawk's band had gone. She thought of the women and children, the elders who moved slowly, all vulnerable to the violence brewing in male voices below. That night, she made her choice. She waited until the town slept, then slipped out into the frozen darkness. The moon was new, providing cover but making navigation treacherous. She'd never ridden at night, never attempted the journey to where she thought the Lakota camps might be, but she had to warn them. The horse she'd borrowed? Stolen. Her conscience corrected, picked its way carefully through the snow. Margaret's hands were numb on the reins, her body shaking with cold and fear. Every shadow could be danger, every sound a threat. She found them by luck more than skill, spotting the faint glow of banked fires in a valley she'd heard Riverhawk describe. As she approached, warriors materialized from the darkness, weapons raised.
Please,
She gasped through chattering teeth.
I need to find Samuel Crowfeather. Riverhawk, I have urgent news.
They kept her under guard while someone fetched him. When Riverhawk emerged from a teepee, his face showed shock, then something that might have been joy before settling into deep concern. Margaret, what are you doing here? How?
The ranch attack,
She interrupted.
The town thinks it was your people. They're planning retaliation. You have to move, tonight.
Riverhawk's expression darkened. He spoke rapidly in Lakota to the other warriors, who dispersed quickly. Then he turned back to her, gripping her arms. It wasn't us. We've been here, peacefully hunting, bothering no one. I know, but they won't care. They want blood, and yours is convenient. He studied her face, taking in her disheveled appearance, the wild determination in her eyes.
You risked everything to warn us. I couldn't let them.
Her voice broke.
There are children here, innocents.
Come, he said, leading her to a teepee where warmth and relative privacy waited. Inside, he wrapped her in buffalo robes, chafing her frozen hands between his own. You brave, foolish woman. What have you done? What I had to, Margaret said through chattering teeth. They already suspect me. After tonight, when they find the horse missing, I can't go back. Riverhawk's hand stilled on hers.
You knew this when you left.
Yes.
And you came anyway.
Yes. He pulled her against him, and she felt him tremble.
I thought I would never see you again. I thought...
Shh. Margaret pressed her face into his neck, breathing him in.
I'm here now.
But their reunion was brief. The camp was already in motion. Tippies coming down with practiced efficiency. Families packing what they could carry. Riverhawk had to help his people, leaving Margaret in the care of an elderly woman who spoke no English but communicated sympathy through gentle touches and warm tea. As dawn approached, the band was ready to move. Riverhawk returned to her, his face grave. We go into the Badlands. It will be hard travel, especially for you.
I'm coming with you,
Margaret said firmly. Margaret? No. She stood, shedding the buffalo robes.
I've made my choice.
I won't go back to pretending I don't see, don't feel. I won't go back to teaching lies while truth gets buried. I choose you. I choose this. He cupped her face in his hands. The life you're choosing, it's not romantic adventure. It's cold and hunger and always running. My people may not accept you. Your people certainly won't. Then we make our own people, Margaret said fiercely. You and I and whoever else chooses love over hate, truth over comfortable lies. Riverhawk kissed her then, pouring all his fear and hope and passion into the contact. Around them, the camp continued its controlled chaos, but for a moment they were the still center of a turning world. Stay close to me, he said when they broke apart. Trust my horse, trust my judgment, and if I tell you to run, you run. Promise me. I promise. Margaret lied, knowing she would never leave him to face danger alone. As the band moved out, Margaret caught suspicious and curious glances from the other Lakota. She was an anomaly, a white woman riding with them by choice, not as captive. Riverhawk's presence beside her provided protection, but she knew acceptance would have to be earned. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd traded one form of being an outsider for another, but this exile was chosen, not imposed. This path, treacherous as it was, led toward truth rather than away from it. Behind them, smoke began to rise from the abandoned campsite, the warriors burning what they couldn't carry, leaving nothing for the pursuing soldiers to claim as victory. Margaret didn't look back. She'd made her choice at the sacred spring, sealed it with forbidden love, and now lived the consequences. As the sun rose over the Badlands, painting the twisted rock formations in shades of gold and red, Margaret felt something she hadn't experienced since Thomas died: purpose. Not the dutiful purpose of widow's work, but the fierce purpose of a woman who'd found something worth fighting for. Beside her, Riverhawk rode with vigilant grace, leading his people away from one danger and probably toward others. But his hand reached out periodically to touch hers, confirming her presence, acknowledging the gift of her choice. "No regrets?" he asked as they paused to water the horses. Margaret looked at him, this man who'd shown her what courage really meant, who'd awakened her heart and challenged her certainties, and smiled. "None," she said, "only gratitude." The journey ahead was uncertain, the challenges immense. But Margaret Sullivan, who'd arrived in the Dakota Territory as a proper Boston widow, now rode into the wilderness as something altogether different, a woman who'd chosen love over safety, truth over comfort, and found herself in the process. The Badlands in winter were a testament to nature's harsh beauty. Margaret had never imagined such landscapes existed. Twisted spires of rock painted in layers of red and white, canyons that cut deep into the earth like ancient wounds, and everywhere the bone-deep cold that seemed to seep through every layer of clothing. They'd been traveling for 3 days when the scouts brought word soldiers were following, a full company with Cherokee trackers. The news rippled through the band like wind through grass, leaving fear in its wake. Chief Standing Elk called council that night. Margaret watched from the edge of the firelight as Riverhawk joined the other warriors in debate. Though she couldn't understand the rapid Lakota, she read the gravity in their faces, the weight of impossible choices. "They want to split up," Riverhawk explained when he returned to her. "Smaller groups are harder to track, but it means families separated, the weak left more vulnerable." "What do you think?" He stared into the fire, jaw tight. "I think we're running out of options. The soldiers know these lands now, have guides who can follow our tracks. And with you here—" He didn't finish, but she heard the unspoken concern. "I'm slowing you down," Margaret said quietly. "No." He gripped her hand. "But your presence complicates things. Some in the band blame you for bringing this trouble." Margaret had felt the hostile stares, heard the muttered words that needed no translation. Only Riverhawk's protection and the intervention of a few elders who remembered kindnesses from other whites had kept things from escalating. "Maybe they're right," she said. "Maybe I should." "Should what return? They'll hang you for a traitor, or worse, stay behind. You'd freeze before morning." His voice roughened with emotion. "You made your choice, and I made mine. We face what comes together." That night, wrapped in buffalo robes in Riverhawk's teepee, Margaret listened to the wind howl outside and tried not to think about the comfortable bed she'd left behind, the warm classroom, the simple certainties of her former life. Riverhawk sensed her restlessness and pulled her closer. "Regrets?" he asked, echoing their familiar refrain. "No," she said, and meant it. "Just adjusting." He was quiet for a moment. "When I was young, the missionaries took me to their school. They cut my hair, forbade our language, tried to wash the Indian from my skin. For months, I dreamed of home every night, woke expecting to see prairie grass instead of wooden walls. How did you bear it?" "By remembering who I was beneath their clothes and rules. By knowing that enduring their world would help me protect mine." He pressed a kiss to her forehead. "You're stronger than you know. Margaret Sullivan, you'll find your way in this world too." The next morning brought crisis. One of the elderly men had fallen ill during the night, burning with fever. The band's healer, a formidable woman named White Dove, worked over him with herbs and prayers, but his labored breathing told its own story. "We can't move him," White Dove declared, "not without killing him." Chief Standing Elk faced an impossible choice: stay and risk the soldiers catching them, or leave the old man behind. Margaret watched the chief age years in moments as he weighed lives against lives.
"I'll stay with him,"
the man's daughter offered, tears streaming. "When he passes, I'll find you."
"No,"
Margaret surprised herself by speaking.
"I'll stay."
Every head turned to her. Riverhawk started to protest, but she continued quickly. "The soldiers are looking for a war band. An elderly man and a white woman. We might pass unnoticed, or at least buy you time." She met the chief's eyes. "Let me do this. Let me help." The debate that followed was fierce, with Riverhawk arguing most vehemently against the plan, but pragmatism won. The band needed every warrior, and Margaret's logic was sound.
2 days,
Riverhawk said finally, his face carved from stone.
"If we haven't found safety by then, I come back for you."
3 days, Margaret countered.
"Give yourselves enough time to truly disappear."
They parted at dawn, the band moving out while Margaret and the elder, Joseph's spotted horse, sheltered in a shallow cave. Riverhawk's goodbye was brief by necessity, but his eyes promised volumes. "Waste Chetsia," he murmured. "I love you always." "And I love you," she replied in carefully practiced Lakota, making him smile despite everything. The days that followed tested Margaret in ways she'd never imagined. Joseph's fever raged, and she fought it with White Dove's hastily taught remedies and her own determination. She melted snow for water, kept the small fire burning just enough for warmth without creating telltale smoke, and talked to Joseph in a mix of English and the few Lakota words she knew. On the second night, he woke lucid for the first time. "You, the teacher woman," he said in accented English. "Yes, rest now. Save your strength." But he gripped her hand with surprising force. "Why?" Margaret understood the real question. "Because your people have become my people. Because love taught me to see beyond the lies I was raised with." Joseph studied her for a long moment. "Riverhawk chose well. You have a warrior's heart and a teacher's body." The next morning brought the sound Margaret had dreaded. Horses, many of them, moving through the canyon below. She peered carefully from their hiding spot and saw blue uniforms, the glint of rifles in winter sun. "Stay silent," she whispered to Joseph, though the fever had taken him again and he barely stirred. The soldiers passed within 50 feet of their cave, so close she could hear their complaints about the cold, their crude jokes about what they'd do when they caught the savages. Margaret pressed herself against the cave wall, scarcely breathing, one hand on Joseph's chest to monitor his shallow breaths. An eternity later, the sounds faded. They'd passed by, following the false trail Riverhawk had laid. Margaret slumped with relief, then returned to her vigil. Joseph's spotted horse died that night, his breathing simply stopping between one moment and the next. Margaret had seen death before, her mother, her husband, but this felt different. She was alone in the wilderness with a man she barely knew, yet whose humanity she'd touched in these intense days. She prepared his body as best she could, following what she'd observed of Lakota customs. As dawn broke, she faced a choice: try to find Riverhawk's band or strike out on her own. The decision was taken from her by the arrival of 3 Lakota warriors she didn't recognize. They materialized from the landscape like ghosts, weapons ready. Margaret raised her hands slowly, speaking the words Riverhawk had taught her for such situations. "I am a friend. Riverhawk is my heart." The warriors exchanged glances. One, older than the others, stepped forward. "You are the teacher woman who warned of the soldiers." "Yes." He studied her, then Joseph's carefully arranged body. "You honored him well." Come, Riverhawk waits. The reunion, when it came hours later in a hidden valley, nearly broke Margaret's composure. Riverhawk swept her into his arms, murmuring prayers of gratitude in both languages. Around them, the band watched with new expressions, not quite acceptance, but respect. Joseph Spotted Horse, Chief Standing Elk asked. Passed peacefully. I did what I could. The chief nodded gravely. His daughter wishes to speak with you. Margaret braced for anger or grief, but the woman embraced her. Thank you, she whispered, for not letting him die alone, for honoring our ways. That night, the band held a ceremony for Joseph. Margaret sat with the women, listening to the death songs that rose into the star-filled sky. She thought of her own losses. How different grief looked when shared by a community instead of born in isolation. You did a brave thing, White Dove said beside her, the healer's English careful but clear. Stupid, maybe, but brave. Margaret smiled through her tears. I'm learning those often go together out here. The older woman cackled. Now you begin to understand Lakota women. We are all a little stupid brave. How else would we survive our men? As the ceremony continued, Margaret felt something shift. She was still an outsider, still white in a world that had good reason to distrust her kind. But she'd proven herself in the currency that mattered here. Courage, loyalty, sacrifice. Riverhawk found her as the gathering dispersed. The scouts found a place, he said, a valley the soldiers don't know, with water and shelter. We'll winter there, rebuild strength for spring travels. And then we keep moving, always moving, until we find a place where we can just be. He cupped her face gently. It's not much of a life to offer you. Margaret leaned into his touch. It's life with you. That makes it everything. They stood together under the vast prairie sky. Two people who'd crossed impossible boundaries to find each other. Behind them, the camp settled for sleep. Ahead lay uncertainty, hardship, the constant shadow of pursuit. But for now, for this moment, they had each other and a community that was slowly making room for their unlikely love. Margaret thought of the schoolhouse in Willow Creek, the narrow life she'd left behind, and felt only relief. She'd chosen love over safety, truth over comfort, and found a freedom she hadn't known she was seeking. The price was high, would continue to be high, but as Riverhawk led her to their teepee, as she lay down beside him in the warmth of shared blankets and shared purpose, Margaret knew she'd make the same choice again. Outside, snow began to fall, covering their tracks and granting them one more day's reprieve from those who would tear them apart. And in the shelter of buffalo hide and belonging, Margaret Sullivan slept peacefully, no longer a stranger to herself or the world she'd chosen. The sacred spring was far behind them now, but what it had awakened flowed on, carving new channels through the landscape of two hearts that had found home in each other against all odds. The hidden valley had sheltered them through the worst of winter, but spring brought new dangers. As snow melted from the high passes, it revealed a changed world. Telegraph lines now stretched across territories that had been open prairie just months before. Railroad camps pushed ever westward, and the soldiers, always the soldiers, spreading like a tide that recognized no boundaries. Margaret had adapted to the rhythms of nomadic life with surprising grace. Her hands, once soft from holding only books and chalk, now bore the calluses of daily survival. She could erect a teepee as swiftly as any Lakota woman, prepare pemmican for travel, read weather signs in cloud formations. But it was the internal changes that ran deepest. You're different, Riverhawk observed one evening as they watched the sunset from a ridge above camp. The frightened woman I met at the spring has become someone else. Not someone else, Margaret corrected, leaning into his warmth. Someone more myself than I ever was before. They'd been running for 4 months now, a deadly game of cat and mouse across the shrinking wilderness. Twice they'd narrowly avoided cavalry patrols. Once, They'd hidden for 3 days in a box canyon while soldiers camped at its mouth, so close that conversation drifted up on the wind. But they'd also found moments of unexpected beauty. Margaret had witnessed the birth of a foal under starlight, had joined the women in gathering the first spring herbs, had learned the stories behind constellations she'd never noticed in her previous life. She'd found family among those who had every reason to reject her, especially White Dove, who'd become both teacher and fierce protector. "Storm coming," the older woman said now, joining them on the ridge. She didn't mean the weather. Chief Standing Elk had called another council. The band was fracturing under constant pressure. Some families wanted to surrender, to accept the reservation life rather than endless flight. Others spoke of fighting, of joining the growing resistance led by warriors whose names were becoming legend. "We can't keep running forever," Riverhawk said that night as they lay together. "My people grow tired, lose hope, and you." He traced the new lines around her eyes, the weathering of sun and wind on her fair skin. "This life ages you." "I'm not fragile," Margaret said firmly. "Don't insult me by suggesting I am." "Not fragile, no, but I see how you give your food to the children when supplies run low, how you stay awake tending the sick even after days of hard travel. You're spending yourself like water in drought." Margaret caught his hand, pressing it to her heart. "And I would spend every drop for this life, for you, for them. Don't you understand? For the first time, I'm living for something that matters." Their conversation was interrupted by commotion in the camp. Riders had arrived. Lakota, but not of their band. Margaret recognized the controlled panic in their movements, the look of people carrying terrible news. The massacre had happened 3 days' ride south, a peaceful village, one that had been negotiating with the government, had been attacked at dawn. No warning, no provocation. Men, women, children, none spared. The survivors spoke of soldiers laughing as they worked, of officers watching approvingly. Margaret was violently sick behind the nearest teepee. When she emerged, shaking, she found Riverhawk waiting. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I know they're my people who did this. I'm sorry. I'm so—" "Stop!" He pulled her against him. "Their crimes are not yours to carry." But she felt the weight anyway. In the days that followed, as the band absorbed refugees from the destroyed village, Margaret threw herself into helping with a desperation that worried those who'd grown to care for her. She tended wounds that turned her stomach, held orphaned children who cried for parents who would never return, listened to stories that haunted her dreams. "You punish yourself for sins you didn't commit," White Dove observed, forcing Margaret to rest on the 4th day. "This helps no one." "How do you bear it?" Margaret asked. "How do you not hate us all?" The older woman was quiet for a long moment. "Hate is easy. It burns hot and fast and leaves only ash. But look there." She pointed to where Riverhawk was teaching young boys to string bows, his patience endless despite their circumstances. "Love is harder. Love endures. Love finds a way even in the darkest season." That night, the chief announced their destination, the gathering place, where many bands would come together for protection and to plan their future. It meant weeks more travel, crossing territories now thick with military patrols, but staying scattered meant certain destruction. They left before dawn, moving like ghosts through landscape that grew more dangerous with each mile. Margaret had learned to ride as the Lakota did, low and fluid, part of the horse rather than merely atop it. She'd also learned to shoot, though Riverhawk prayed she'd never need to use the skill. On the 7th day, their luck ran out. The patrol appeared from nowhere, cutting off their route through a narrow pass. There was no time for elaborate plans, barely time to think. Chief Standing Elk made the hard choice quickly. "Warriors with me. Women and children up the ravine. Move!" Margaret found herself swept along with the fleeing families. But at the ravine's mouth, she pulled up short. Below, she could see Riverhawk and the other warriors preparing to buy time with their lives. "No," she breathed, then louder, "No!" She wheeled her horse around. Ignoring White Dove's shout of protest, the rifle Riverhawk had taught her to use was in her hands without conscious thought. She'd never killed, had never imagined herself capable of it. But watching soldiers advance on the man she loved changed everything. Her first shot went wide, but it drew attention. Soldiers turned toward this unexpected threat, a white woman defending Indians. The confusion bought precious seconds. Her second shot found its mark, sending a soldier tumbling from his saddle. "Margaret, get back!" Riverhawk's voice carried over the chaos, but she was beyond hearing. She fought like the cornered creature she was, with desperation rather than skill. The warriors, inspired by her fearlessness or shamed by it, rallied. The skirmish was brief but vicious, ending with the soldiers retreating, several of their number dead or wounded. In the aftermath, Margaret sat in the dust, staring at her hands. They'd taken life. She'd crossed another line that couldn't be uncrossed. Riverhawk knelt before her, checking frantically for injuries. Finding none, he pulled her against him hard enough to hurt. "Foolish woman," he muttered in Lakota. "Brave, impossible, foolish woman. I couldn't let them. I couldn't just watch." "I know." He helped her stand on shaking legs. "I know." The band moved swiftly, knowing pursuit would come, but something had shifted again. The warriors who'd witnessed Margaret's defense nodded to her with newfound respect. Even those who'd remained suspicious now looked at her differently. "You fought for us," one young warrior said simply. "You are Lakota now, whatever your skin says." That night, in hurried camp, Chief Standing Elk approached their fire. "A Riverhawk speaks truth about you," he said to Margaret in careful English. "You have warrior spirit, but warriors must be wise, not just brave. You risked much today. I risked no more than any woman here would risk for her family." Margaret replied. The chief studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "This is so." He turned to Riverhawk. "The council has decided, at the gathering, if we reach it, you will be married in our way. It is time to stop pretending this bond between you is anything less than sacred." After he left, Margaret and Riverhawk sat in stunned silence. They'd been living as husband and wife in all but ceremony, but to have it acknowledged, blessed by the leadership. "Your chief is right," Margaret said finally. "Today, when I thought I might lose you, I realized pretense is just another kind of lie. I want to be your wife in every way your people recognize." Riverhawk cupped her face tenderly. "And if we're caught, you could claim captivity now. Might find mercy. As my wife." "As your wife, I share your fate completely." "Yes," she managed a shaky smile. "I thought we'd established I'm foolish and brave." They reached the gathering place after 2 more weeks of hard travel, finding a sight that took Margaret's breath away. Hundreds of teepees spread across a hidden valley, multiple bands coming together in defiance of government orders. It was beautiful and heartbreaking, a last flowering of a way of life under siege. The ceremony took place 3 days later, under a canopy of stars. Margaret wore a dress made by White Dove and the other women, soft doeskin decorated with beads and quills. Riverhawk stood tall and proud beside her, his face showing the joy they'd had so little chance to express. The rituals were different from the Christian wedding she'd had with Thomas, but no less sacred. They smoked from the ceremonial pipe, their hands bound together with sweetgrass rope as prayers rose in Lakota and Cheyenne, and even a few words of English for Margaret's sake. "You are no longer 2, but 1. The holy man intoned. "Your spirits are joined, your paths merged. Walk together in courage and wisdom, and may your love be a bridge between worlds." As the celebration continued around them with drums and dancing, Margaret and Riverhawk stole away to the edge of camp. Above them, the Milky Way stretched like a river of light across the prairie sky. "My wife," Riverhawk said softly, as if testing the words. "My husband," she replied, and felt the rightness of it in her bones. They'd found each other across an impossible divide, had chosen love despite every force arrayed against them. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new dangers. The gathering couldn't last. Too many people in one place attracted attention. Soon they'd scatter again, seeking safety that grew more elusive each day. But tonight, Margaret Sullivan Crow Feather danced with her husband under ancient stars, surrounded by people who'd become family, and felt herself complete in ways she'd never imagined possible. The sacred spring where they'd met seemed like a lifetime ago, but its gift flowed on love that refused to recognize the boundaries others would impose, truth that demanded to be lived regardless of cost. When dawn came, it would find her changed once more. No longer the grieving widow or the uncertain refugee, but a woman who'd found her place in the world by daring to love without limits, to fight without apology, to become fully herself in the crucible of impossible circumstances. The price of such transformation was high and would grow higher still. But as Riverhawk led her to their marriage teepee, as drums echoed across the valley like a heartbeat of resistance, Margaret knew she would pay it gladly, again and again, for the profound gift of this unlikely, unsanctioned, absolutely essential love. The Mexican border town of Esperanza straddled two worlds, and in that liminal space, Margaret and Riverhawk found their refuge. They'd traveled for 3 months after the gathering dispersed, moving steadily south as winter loosened its grip. The journey had been grueling, dodging patrols, rationing supplies, losing friends along the way. But they'd survived, and now stood at the edge of something that might be called hope. The community White Dove had told them about proved real, a collection of adobe houses and small farms where Apache Mexican settlers, displaced Lakota, and even a few white outlaws lived in uneasy harmony. It existed in a legal gray zone, too remote for either government to care much about, protected by desert on one side and mountains on the other. "It's not pretty," said Marcus Webb, the former Union soldier who'd greeted them. His left arm was gone below the elbow, and his eyes held the haunted look of a man who'd seen too much. "But nobody here asks questions about your past if you don't cause trouble in the present." Margaret gazed around at the dusty streets, the mixture of building styles, the children playing who bore faces of every shade. After months of constant flight, the simple fact of buildings that stayed in one place felt miraculous. They were given a small adobe house on the settlement's edge, 2 rooms with a cooking area and a patch of ground for gardening. Riverhawk immediately set about reinforcing it, checking sight lines and escape routes with the vigilance of a man who'd learned never to fully relax. Margaret understood. Even in refuge, the habits of survival died hard. "We'll need work," Riverhawk said that first night as they sat on rough wooden chairs, sharing a simple meal. "I can break horses, help with building. You." "I can teach," Margaret said firmly. "I saw at least a dozen children today. This place needs a school." Riverhawk smiled, the expression softening the harsh lines that constant danger had carved into his face. "Of course you would think of that first." Within a week, Margaret had converted an abandoned stable into a makeshift schoolroom. Parents were skeptical at first. What could this wind-burned white woman offer their children? But when she began teaching in English, Spanish, and the smattering of Apache and Lakota she'd learned, when she showed equal patience with the rancher's son and the Apache girl, word spread. "You have a gift," said Maria Santos, whose husband ran the general store. She'd brought her twin daughters to enroll after watching Margaret work. "The children trust you. They recognize someone else who doesn't quite fit," Margaret replied, watching her mixed group of students practice their letters. "It helps." Riverhawk found his place too, his skill with horses quickly becoming known. The local ranchers, Mexican and white alike, cared less about his heritage than his ability to gentle wild mustangs. He also joined the informal group of men who protected the settlement, riding patrol with former Confederate and Union soldiers, Apache warriors, and Mexican vaqueros, men who'd found common ground in exile. Their life took on rhythms Margaret had thought lost forever. Morning coffee together before she walked to the school. Evenings working their small garden, coaxing life from the desert soil. Nights in their narrow bed. No longer listening for pursuit, but simply holding each other, marveling at the gift of stillness. But the past wasn't done with them. The first sign came when Margaret missed her monthly bleeding. Then again, White Dove, who'd settled with them in Esperanza, confirmed what Margaret both hoped and feared.
A child?
The older woman said, her hands gentle on Margaret's belly, growing strong despite the hard journey. Margaret sat in stunned silence. She'd lost 2 pregnancies in her first marriage, had been told more would be unlikely. The months of hardship should have made conception impossible. Yet here was life, stubborn and insistent. Riverhawk's reaction when she told him was to pull her into his arms and hold her so tightly she could barely breathe. When he finally pulled back, tears tracked down his weathered cheeks.
A child,
he whispered in wonder. Then, more soberly,
here in this uncertain place.
Where better? Margaret asked. Where we're not illegal, where they can grow up seeing all kinds of people living in peace. But peace, she was learning, was always temporary for people like them. The trouble started small. New faces in the settlement, asking too many questions. Men who claimed to be traders but whose eyes lingered too long on Riverhawk, on the other Lakota families who'd found refuge here. Margaret noticed them watching the school, marking which children belonged to which parents. Indian agents, Marcus Webb confirmed, spitting tobacco juice into the dust. Bounty hunters too, most likely. Governments offering good money for renegades to force onto reservations. Riverhawk's hand went to his knife.
Let them try.
Won't be that simple, Webb warned. They'll wait, gather information, maybe try to turn the Mexicans against you, claim you're bringing trouble, divide and conquer. It's what they do best. Margaret felt the familiar tightness in her chest, the return of fear she'd almost forgotten. But now it was sharpened by new terror, not just for herself and Riverhawk, but for the life growing inside her. We could go deeper into Mexico, she suggested that night. Riverhawk shook his head. Running forever is no life for a child, and he placed a protective hand on her still flat belly. You need stability now. Care White Dove can provide, safety for the birth. They weren't the only ones facing hard choices. The small Lakota community met regularly, debating options. Some wanted to fight if the agents came. Others spoke of trying to disappear into the Mexican population, cutting their hair and abandoning traditional ways. We lose ourselves either way, observed Joseph Talltree, one of the elders. Fight and die as Lakota, or live as shadows of who we were.
There's another way,
Margaret said suddenly. The men turned to her in surprise. Women rarely spoke in council, and white women never, but she pressed on. We make ourselves too valuable to remove. This settlement survives because everyone contributes something unique. We need to become irreplaceable. Over the following weeks, they put the plan into action. Riverhawk and the other Lakota men took on the most dangerous job in the region, guarding supply trains through Apache territory. Their knowledge of indigenous tactics made them invaluable to the Mexican merchants. Margaret expanded the school, adding evening classes for adults who wanted to learn English for trade. White Dove established a clinic, her traditional healing methods proving effective against ailments the local Mexican doctor couldn't treat. Slowly, the settlement's attitude shifted when the Indian agents finally made their move, approaching the Mexican alcalde with offers of money for information about fugitive Indians. They met unexpected resistance. These people are under Mexican protection, the alcalde stated firmly. They work, they contribute, they cause no trouble. You have no authority here. The agents persisted, trying bribery, then threats. But Esperanza had survived by protecting its own, and the bonds forged in exile proved stronger than government gold. Still, Margaret knew it was only a reprieve. The agents would return with more men, more pressure. The U.S. government's reach grew longer every year. As her pregnancy advanced, she found unexpected joy even amid uncertainty. The women of Esperanza, Mexican, Apache, white, and mixed rallied around her. They shared remedies for morning sickness, sewed tiny clothes, told stories of their own births to calm her fears. "You carry a bridge child," Maria Santos said one day, hands resting on Margaret's swollen belly. "Born between worlds, belonging to all and none. Such children often carry special medicine." Riverhawk built a cradle with the focused intensity of a man creating something sacred. He carved symbols from both their traditions into the wood Lakota prayers for protection alongside the Celtic knots Margaret remembered from her grandmother's stories. But their happiness was shadowed by news from the north. The resistance was failing. One by one, the free bands were being forced onto reservations or destroyed. Chiefs who'd sworn to fight to the death were negotiating surrender to save their people. The frontier was closing, and with it, the spaces where people like them could exist. "Perhaps we should be grateful," Riverhawk said one night, his hand gentle on her belly as the baby kicked. "To have had this time at all, to have created this life." "Don't talk like that," Margaret said fiercely. "We're not done yet. We're not giving up." But when the pains began on a sweltering July night, all thoughts fled except the immediate reality of birth. It was long and difficult, the baby positioned wrong. White Dove worked with calm efficiency, while Riverhawk held Margaret's hands and whispered prayers in 2 languages. When their daughter finally emerged, screaming and perfect, the sunrise was painting the desert in shades of gold and rose. Margaret, exhausted beyond measure but filled with fierce joy, watched Riverhawk hold their child for the first time. "What do we name her?" he asked, tears streaming unashamedly down his face. Margaret thought of all they'd been through, all the boundaries crossed and prices paid. She thought of the sacred spring where love had found them, the long flight that had tested them, this precarious piece they'd carved from an unforgiving world. "Hope," she said finally. "We name her Hope. In Lakota, too. What's the word?" "Asakaj," Riverhawk murmured, pressing a kiss to the baby's forehead. "Hope who brings light." The settlement celebrated the birth with a mixture of traditions: Mexican baptism water and Lakota blessing smoke, Apache protection charms and Irish lullabies. Margaret remembered from childhood. Hope belonged to all of them, and none of them. A living symbol of what was possible when love refused to recognize the world's cruel divisions. But even as Margaret held her daughter, even as she watched Riverhawk's face transform with protective tenderness, she knew their story wasn't finished. The agents would return. The world that had no place for their love would try again to tear them apart. For now, though, in this adobe room with walls that didn't move, surrounded by the most unlikely family imaginable, Margaret Sullivan Crowfeather allowed herself this moment of perfect happiness. Her daughter's skin was the color of honey, her eyes dark like her father's but with gold flecks that caught the light like her mother's. She was beautiful and impossible and absolutely real. "Whatever comes," Margaret whispered to Hope as she nursed, "you were worth it all. You're proof that love finds a way, always finds a way." Outside, Esperanza woke to another day balanced between worlds. The desert bloomed despite the heat, stubborn life pushing through hostile ground. And in a small house on the settlement's edge, a family that shouldn't exist by any reasonable measure faced the sunrise together, ready for whatever impossible thing love would ask of them next. The years in Esperanza had been kind to them, as kind as years could be to people living on the margins of the world. Hope grew strong and wild, a child of 2 worlds who moved between them with the fluid grace of water. At 15, she spoke 4 languages and could track as well as any Lakota warrior, solve equations that challenged Margaret's teaching abilities, and ride horses with her father's skill. But time had marked them all. Riverhawk's black hair showed silver at the temples, and the harsh sun had carved deep lines around his eyes. Margaret's hands, once smooth, bore the calluses and spots of decades spent building a life from stubborn earth. They were in their 50s now, considered old by frontier standards, but still vital, still very much in love. The settlement had grown too. What began as a refuge for outcasts had become a proper town, with a telegraph office and a monthly mail coach. Margaret's school had expanded into a proper building with 3 rooms and 2 assistant teachers. Riverhawk ran a successful horse ranch with several Lakota families who'd settled permanently. On this particular autumn morning, Margaret stood at the window of their expanded adobe home, watching Hope work with a young Mustang in the corral. Their daughter moved with her father's patience, her mother's determination, creating something new from the combination. "She has a suitor," Riverhawk said, joining her at the window. Margaret smiled. "Which one? The banker's son from Tucson or the young Apache teacher?" "Both, I think. And that Mexican rancher's boy who keeps finding excuses to visit." Riverhawk wrapped his arms around her from behind, resting his chin on her shoulder. "Our daughter breaks hearts in multiple languages." "She's waiting," Margaret said softly, "for someone who sees her completely, not just the parts that fit their world." "Like her mother did," Riverhawk murmured, pressing a kiss to her neck. They were interrupted by Hope herself, bursting through the door with characteristic energy. "Riders coming from the north. Papa, I think it's Samuel Talltree." Riverhawk straightened, suddenly alert. Samuel was Joseph Talltree's son, now a liaison between the reservation Lakota and those who'd remained free. His visits always brought a mixture of news and worry. The reunion was bittersweet. Samuel had aged hard in the years since they'd last met, his face bearing the weight of watching his people's world shrink year by year. He brought news that the last free bands had been forced onto reservations, that children were being taken to boarding schools where their hair was cut and their languages forbidden. "But I also bring a request," Samuel said, sitting in their kitchen as Margaret served coffee and fry bread. "There's talk of opening a school on the Pine Ridge Reservation, one where our children could learn the white man's knowledge without losing themselves. They need teachers who understand both worlds." Margaret's hand stilled on the coffee pot. Riverhawk met her eyes across the table, a whole conversation in a glance. It would mean leaving here. Samuel continued, "Living on the reservation, under government watch. But you could make a difference. Both of you." That night, Margaret and Riverhawk walked to the small grove of cottonwoods outside town, where they often went to think. The same stars that had witnessed their forbidden love now looked down on a different crossroads. "We've built a good life here," Riverhawk said finally. "Yes," Margaret agreed. "But is it the life we're meant for now?" "What about Hope? This is her home." Margaret smiled sadly. "Hope is ready to fly. She doesn't need us the way she once did. But those children on the reservation..." They talked until dawn, weighing safety against purpose, comfort against calling. In the end, it was Hope herself who made the decision clear. "Go," she said simply when they told her of the offer. "I've watched you both my whole life. You're teachers, healers, bridge builders. Those children need you." "And you?" Margaret asked, touching her daughter's face. Hope grinned, looking remarkably like her father in that moment. "I have my own path to ride. Maybe I'll follow later, maybe not. But you taught me to choose love over fear, purpose over comfort. How can I ask less of you?" The leaving was harder than Margaret had imagined. Esperanza had become home in ways the Boston of her youth never was. But as they packed their few precious belongings, including journals Margaret had kept throughout their journey, she felt a familiar quickening. Once more into the unknown. But this time by choice rather than necessity. The journey north took 3 weeks. When they finally crested the last ridge and saw the Pine Ridge Reservation spread below, Margaret's heart sank. Rows of government buildings, fenced boundaries, a people contained. This wasn't the freedom they'd fought for. But then she saw the children, dozens of them, watching the wagons approach with curious eyes. In their faces, she saw Riverhawk's pride, her own stubborn hope, the future waiting to be shaped. Their first months were brutal. Government agents watched suspiciously. Many Lakota viewed them as outsiders despite Riverhawk's blood. The conditions were harsh, supplies limited, hope in short supply. But slowly, carefully, they built something new. Margaret taught reading and writing, but also critical thinking. Riverhawk taught traditional skills alongside the civilized ones the government demanded. They created a space where children could be fully themselves, where both worlds could coexist. "You're that teacher," a young woman said one day, approaching Margaret after class. "The one who loved a Lakota man when it was forbidden. My grandmother tells your story." Margaret blinked in surprise. "I didn't know people knew." "Oh yes, the woman who chose love over safety, who fought alongside warriors, who bore a daughter of two worlds." The woman smiled. "You give us hope that boundaries aren't forever." As the years passed, their impact grew. Students who'd learned to walk in both worlds became leaders, teachers, healers. Some left the reservation and succeeded in the white world without losing themselves. Others stayed and fought for their people's rights with the tools Margaret and Riverhawk had given them. Hope visited regularly, eventually bringing a husband, the Apache teacher, as it turned out, and grandchildren who carried the mixture forward another generation. Watching Riverhawk teach his grandson to string a bow while Margaret read to his granddaughter, the circle felt complete. On their 40th anniversary, they returned to the sacred spring where it all began. The settlement of Willow Creek had grown into a proper town, but the spring remained hidden, protected by the same grove of cottonwoods. They were alone there, two people grown old together against all odds. "Regrets?" Riverhawk asked, their ritual question taking on new weight with age. Margaret looked at him, this man who'd been worth every sacrifice, every hard choice, every moment of joy and sorrow, and smiled. "Only one," she said. His eyebrows rose in surprise. "That we don't have another lifetime to love each other in." He pulled her close, and they stood together by the water that had witnessed their beginning. Somewhere, their daughter taught school in a thriving town. Somewhere, their grandchildren grew strong and free. Somewhere, the children they taught carried forward the lesson that love recognizes no boundaries, that different doesn't mean less than, that courage comes in many forms. When Riverhawk passed 3 winters later, Margaret held his hand and sang him over in the Lakota way he'd taught her. She lived 5 more years, long enough to see their first great-grandchild, long enough to finish writing their story in full. Hope found her mother's body peaceful in bed. The completed journals stacked neatly on the table, the last entry, dated the night before, read, "Tomorrow I go to find him, my Riverhawk, my heart. I am not afraid. We proved that love makes all things possible, that boundaries exist only in small minds and smaller hearts. To those who come after, remember, choose bravely, love freely, and never let anyone tell you who you're allowed to be. The spring flows eternal, as does the love found beside it." Hope buried her parents side by side near the sacred spring, with a headstone that read simply, "They chose love." And their story lived on, whispered around campfires and teaching circles, proof that sometimes the most forbidden loves create the most necessary bridges. In Esperanza, in Pine Ridge, in 100 places between, children grew up knowing that once upon a time, a proper Boston widow and a Lakota warrior looked past everything that should have kept them apart and saw only each other. They chose the harder path, the dangerous path, the path of truth and transformation. And in choosing each other, they chose a future where such choices might someday need no courage at all, where love might simply be love, where bridges between worlds might become highways traveled freely by all who dare to see past the surface to the sacred spring that flows in every heart. Their love story ended as it began, by water that knows no boundaries, under stars that shine on all equally, in the eternal now where all souls who've truly loved wait to reunite, and somewhere in the space between worlds, Margaret Sullivan Crowfeather and Samuel Riverhawk dance on, forever young, forever free, forever proof that love is always stronger than the forces that would divide us.
Thank you so much for listening to this story. I'd love to hear where you're listening from. Please share in the comments below so we can connect and discuss what this tale meant to you. If you enjoyed this Wild West love story, please subscribe to Wild West Night. Hit the like button, and don't forget to press the hype button to help more people discover this story of forbidden love and courage. Your support means everything